right, everybody, hello. So today we're talking about ethics. We'll be talking about what ethics are, who decides which ethical principles we abide by, when those principles should be ignored or avoided, or the cases that spark the need for ethical principles to be there in the first place. Okay, so let's get right into it. So the American Psychological Association, the first group that oversees ethical practices, specifically in psychology, psychological research, is the APA. We've come to know them for their formatting as well, but they have their own set of ethical principles that they suggest all researchers abide by. More than suggest, these things are actually reviewed by the APA and by other bodies to make sure that science is meeting up to these ethical practices. You can lose your license if you're not following these things. So we have, or even end up in prison. Okay, that's possible too. So we have 5 core principles: beneficence and non-maleficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect. Respect for persons and animals. And we're going to talk about each of these separately. So beneficence and non-maleficence. Practice saying that. Our first principle, this is very similar to medical practice. When we set out to conduct psychological research, we are hoping to do no harm. We do not want to harm anybody or anything that we are engaging with professionally. In some cases, this is physical harm, things like giving pharmacological treatments that might physically harm somebody. We want to prevent and do no harm to participants. We don't want to hurt animals. We don't want to put people in situations where they might get injured by their significant other, so on. So psychologically as well, we've talked in this class about the bounds on our research projects and how we're unable to approach certain topics because of ethical considerations. So for example, if we were to ask somebody about their suicidal ideation and they reported that they are currently thinking about suicide, it would be our ethical responsibility to refer them to a psychologist. Because we're working on a small scale in this class and asking other students, we want to avoid this altogether. We want to avoid doing any type of harm, be it physical, psychological, financially, and even socially as well. Financial harm might seem odd. How could a research study financially harm somebody? Maybe a very poor family is traveling a very far distance to participate in a study that has a promising treatment for a disorder they might have. While this might not seem unethical on the surface, we don't want anyone to be taken advantage of in any way. Okay. Fidelity and responsibility. So the idea here is that psychologists and researchers, we're talking about two sides of the same coin, therapists and counselors, but also researchers working with people in different ways, are in relationships of trust with their clients, participants, or whoever they might be working with, okay? So psychologists are to take responsibility for their actions and adhere to a professional standard of conduct, which is what we're discussing here, as well as other groups that oversee ethical standards. You still need to comply with whatever groups apply to the situation. Integrity. I'm sure you've heard this word before outside this context. It's being honest. So academic integrity, we have an academic integrity clause here at our institution. Same goes for research on a higher level, no plagiarism, report work honestly, don't fabricate data, then report it as if you found it yourself or that you've found something great or whatever. You know, be accurate, be honest, be truthful. Unfortunately, science can be competitive at times. Sometimes you're competing for funding with other groups or researchers. Sometimes it's required to keep your job. And it can sometimes incite this lack of integrity to get ahead. Luckily, we have safeguards in science like repeating studies to ensure that findings that don't seem true or seem off base can be tested for their integrity. So this one's relatively straightforward. Honesty, right? We need honesty in our science and in our psychological practices. Justice, the scales of justice. We've seen these in this class before. So remember, I like to say that psychology is a lot like the law, that information is innocent until it's proven guilty, but this is different. We're talking about justice of persons, fairness. So the idea is that we will have equality of access to all the benefits that psychology provides. That is, of course, a fairy tale. It's an ideal. It's never going to happen, but we aim for this. We've tried to make this happen. Psychology provides a lot in terms of assisting what I like to call the human condition, right? We have therapy practices in place that we know are effective. We have research that can help inform the masses. But there is, of course, an issue here with this particular ethical principle, equality of access to the benefits of psychology. because we've discussed how, this isn't entirely true. It's not entirely possible. And if we remember back to the weird populations, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people have more access to research in psychology in general. So this is a principle that is applied, that is attempted to make its way into mainstream psychology and the use of our psychological information. We want to consider this. We don't want psychology to remain the psychology of just psychology students. We don't want it to remain only for the wealthy and educated. We want its benefits to reach all, which also means we need to be studying all. Okay. So respect for persons. Our last one is called Respect for Persons. We'll be getting into greater depth with this when we start to create our own surveys in this course. The biggest concern here is privacy, confidentiality, dignity, and self-determination. So what does all of that mean? That means you have a choice to participate in research. You should never be forced. Not only do you have a choice, but your information should be protected. This is a big issue currently in our technological age where information is everywhere you look. People are stealing your information. People are obviously concerned with their private information, and this is a barrier for scientists to overcome. So people are not always open to sharing their personal information. But we follow standards to ensure that people's rights are being protected in this way as much as possible. We will collect data in a private and confidential manner, and we will give our participants the autonomy, the independence, the free will to make decisions about themselves. So if you're answering a survey and a question makes you uncomfortable, you can stop. That's part of the deal. All research is voluntary, okay, if it's ethical. So where this gets tricky is when we're working with potentially vulnerable populations, vulnerable groups. So think about groups of people who might be manipulated by researchers or might not understand what's being asked of them. Children, the elderly, cognitive disabilities. So it's the role of the researcher and the responsibility of the researcher or therapist to understand the limits or the vulnerabilities of the group that they're working with. Okay. All right, animal research. So we have a similar model for animal research as we do for human ethics. So we have a group called IACUC, International Animal Care and Use Committee. They're similar to the APA in that they have a set of ethical principles that those who use animals in their research must abide by. It is an independent group from APA, but they work together, right? So this is complex because animal research is done in a number of ways. We can just observe animals, watch them, don't interfere at all. But animal research gets as extreme as testing medication on animals or injecting substances into animals. So while we're talking about ethics, we can talk about, we can argue to death the ethics of this. There are two very extreme sides to the idea. There are some people that think no animal should be captive under any circumstance, not even domestic pets. That's one far end of the spectrum. The other end is that we should stop at no cost for the pursuit of science, and to help people, that if we can pursue scientific advancement using animal models, we should, and that the sacrifice to those animals' quality of life, or even their life period, is worthwhile. So we are not here to talk about what's right. You should certainly give it some thought and decide where you stand on using animals in research, but the idea is there is a group in place to protect them, okay? Rules that you have to follow by. So this group makes sure that living standards are up to a certain standard, that harm is minimized, okay? Animal research is happening all around us. Lots of vaccines are tested in pigs and rats. We have animal models that are very comparable to humans in multiple ways. We have species like rats and pigs that have similar organ structures to humans, so we can model the effects of medication and how it'll move through the body in those animals. We have more cognitive models that we can use, things like apes and chimps. Primate research is often done to compare human behavior to their behavior. Okay. But it's controversial. The IRB. So the next piece here is something called the IRB. The IRB is similar to the APA in that they have oversight. They look over research being done in the psychological field. Okay. The IRB was specifically established to protect the rights of human research subjects or participants, although they do usually look over animal research as well. So what the IRB does is a cost-benefit analysis of any research being done. So what a cost-benefit analysis does is determines if the benefit of the research will outweigh any of the cost. When we're talking about cost, we're talking about negative effects to those who are participating. So you might be thinking, why would we ever want to harm somebody when we're doing psychological research? But think about psychological phenomena that we want to research. Things like fear, things like pain, things like coercion, abuse. So even if we want to study them, we don't want to inflict them on anybody, but they might be there as part of an experiment. So drug studies, for instance. Take a drug with a very tough side effect. We always hear this in our pharmaceutical advertisements, right? All the side effects. So if a medication is promising in treating a chronic illness, we might be willing to take the risk for the benefit of potentially alleviating or curing whatever issue that person is facing. But there also might be an associated cost with it. So, I'm sure you've heard all the side effects: shortness of breath, hair loss, liver damage, death. The list goes on and on. So those are the costs, the potential costs of participating. But there's also benefits. So, sometimes it's worth it. When you do any research, you have to submit a proposal to the IRB. Any institution that has research going on its campus will usually go through an IRB, the Institutional Review Board. You submit a proposal, then you have to be transparent. You have to be honest with what you're doing in your particular study. If you want to change your method, you usually have to submit again. So the IRB proposal process can be really tough. It can take a long time. They might come back with changes. They usually do. That you have to change your study before they'll approve it, and that really annoys researchers. So it's there for a reason, but it can be really irritating. Okay. So some of the principles of the IRB are similar to the APA's principles. Okay. Some are different. So no harm, that's the same as the beneficence and non-maleficence, but easier to say. Informed consent. So this explains you have to explain the procedures and the rights of the research to the participant, and their rights and procedures of the research. So you'll explain things like this will be anonymous and confidential, or it won't, that you're able to stop at any time. In fact, we'll be putting an informed consent on our survey, so when we send them out to others, they understand their rights and are informed of their consent to participate in our studies. Confidentiality, protection, or privacy of research participants. We will not be collecting identifying information on any of our participants. Deception. Deception doesn't sound like a very ethical word, but deception is often used in psychological research. Deception is meant to sort of throw somebody off of what you are trying to measure. So while this seems unethical, we can actually do this in ways that produce very little to no harm in an individual. Let me give you an example. A study I had heard about was looking at sensation and perception, another field of psychology that focuses on our senses. So what information do we intake from our various senses, and how does it affect our mind and body? So this sensation and perception study was aiming to determine if the sounds of running water increase the urge to urinate in individuals. So I'm sure we've all heard of this phenomenon before, but somebody decided that they wanted to put it to the test. So they didn't want to just sit someone in a room with running water and ask them if the running water made them need to urinate more. That would give away what the study was all about. And then there's bias, and some people might try to mess up the study or please the researchers. And, so there's all this response bias and everything. So what they came up with was a screening survey, a diabetes screening survey, where one of the symptoms is an increased urge to urinate. Okay, they had 2 rooms where people took the survey, one quiet room with no running water, one with running water. There were over 20 questions on the survey, but they were only interested in the one question: how badly do you need to urinate right now? That was the question that they honed in on out of all of those questions. So that was some deception. They didn't think the participants didn't think they were being tested on what they were actually being tested on, but there's no harm whatsoever done to the participants. So deception can be useful. We don't fully inform the participant about the research, but we want to be sure that's not doing any harm if we do. Although there are some exceptions to that, but that's very, very rare. And obviously you won't need to worry about that. Debriefing. After a study is completed, the researchers will debrief what was actually done. So this is sometimes immediately after a study is completed. Sometimes it's a ways into the future. It depends on how important the nature of the deception is in your study. So informed consent details. Let's talk about this in more detail. So informed consent is a document that includes the purpose, procedures, and approximate duration of the research. Okay, basically, so the participant knows what they're getting into. They're also aware that they can refuse to participate and they can withdraw their research. This is very important. If somebody participates in a survey and then contacts you and says they don't want to be part of your survey anymore, we have to destroy their records, not just take them out of the study. We can't keep their data anymore. We have to completely destroy their records of participation. Okay, so this is how we try and maintain trust with participants, because as you'll see here momentarily, I'll give examples of studies that have broken the trust, the public trust in researchers. Okay. More about debriefing. So debriefing is a time for the researcher to talk to the participant and address any questions that the participant has, then inform them of the results of the research if they care to know. Oftentimes, individuals will participate in research to get a diagnostic test of a disorder that they might be suspicious they have, but they're not sure. So they'll ultimately have the rights to that information once the research concludes to a point where that information can be shared. Okay. So a lot of cases don't require debriefing. Many studies will be straightforward enough where the information present will be explained throughout the course of the study. In our case, most of us will be this way. We won't need to debrief students on the survey they just took, but it is common practice for research, and the more chances of harm to the person being studied, the more important this is. All right, now we're talking about incentives. You can incentivize people to take part in your research, and this goes back to taking financial advantage of participants. This can go two ways: paying a poor family to participate in research, sort of almost bribing them to participate, or the inverse can be true, that the research can be seen as so valuable that families or individuals will take steps that will financially disadvantage themselves in order to participate for that potential benefit, okay, of being part of the study. So it's complicated. There's lots of different scenarios here, but incentives are part of the way that we soften that, okay? We can incentivize people to participate using money, using gift cards, using credit in classes. You might have encountered that before where you got extra credit for being part of a study. But the idea is it has to be fair across participants, and it cannot be used to manipulate or bribe or target people. I mean, it is kind of a bribe, but it can be so extreme that it's manipulative. Okay, so it's usually made as fair as possible and made the same across the board. All right, a little bit more about deception. So deception can't be done if it incurs risk. Individuals must be debriefed if deception is used so that they understand what the research was. And sometimes deception can be done if it incurs risk, but it's... Ooh. Firework. Sorry, that scared the crap out of me. Can deception be positive? Yes, it can be. It can be a great way to get information without giving away your study or potentially manipulating responses from your participants. All right, what's an extremely common form of deception research? Like I mentioned in the intro video, placebo pill, right? Sugar pill, inactive pill, okay? So how one of these studies would work. So let's take a psychological disorder. Let's take fibromyalgia, a nerve pain disorder. Let's say we want to test the efficacy of a new pill that treats fibromyalgia. So we would get a sample of individuals with this disorder. Let's say we get 60. Then our basic experimental design, the heart of an experimental design, is randomly assigning participants to a control group and an experimental group. They're randomly assigned in a blind manner. We use the term blind, and oftentimes even in a double-blind way where the researchers themselves don't even know who received what pill. So the researchers are even being deceived in that case. So the idea is we don't want anybody thinking that they're not getting medicated. So we're deceiving everybody in the study into believing they're getting medicated, and the researchers don't know. So say we have a group of 60 people. We give 30 the placebo, 30 the active pill. Researchers will collect data on those individuals and then ultimately compare those groups. So usually somebody like a research assistant will be keeping track of who is actually in which group, and then participants might be like marked with a symbol or numbers or something like that. So it's very common. It sounds bad because you have people who have these disorders who are looking for help, and they go to get help and they're being deceived into believing they're getting medication. But that's what debriefing is all about, and that's what informed consent is all about, okay? And that's what incentives are all about. So oftentimes they'll give participants the opportunity to try the active version of the drug after the study if they're interested in doing so. So deception is common. It's useful. It's one of the most common ways Deception is used with placebos, and it can be helpful to make sure that we're getting valid data. Okay. But there are lots of unethical studies. Okay, so now I'm going to walk us through a couple of these. The reason that all these ethical guidelines are in place is because they have been violated in ways in the past. So in the past, we've maybe not recognized how important it is to have these safeguards in place, or people just didn't care. So the Monster study, this happened in 1939. It's a great example. A husband and a wife, a set of researchers, set out to complete this study. And this was done in Iowa, and their population of interest was children. Okay, so the sample they used were 22 orphans. They got consent from the orphanage, but not from these children's parents, of course, because they didn't have parents. And in a normal situation these days, in the modern day, we have to get what we call assent from kids, a verbal agreement to participate in what's being done, and we need informed consent from the parents. Neither of those things were obtained here, and of course it wouldn't even have been possible in this situation. Okay. This was also a long time ago, but these children were not given rights. They're not given the rights that we try to hold our participants to, and especially because back then people didn't really consider that children had rights. Okay, so it really isn't surprising. And then they're orphans on top of that. So what happened here, they took 22 orphans, split them into two groups. They gave one group affirmative speech therapy, the other group negative speech therapy. If the children had a pre-existing stutter or any other speech impediment, if they were in the positive group, they would be reassured of their abilities, positively reinforced to try and improve their speech. If they were in the other group, aversive techniques were used. If a child made a mistake with their speech, expressed their speech impediment, slurred, stuttered, whatever, they would be belittled, they'd be ridiculed, they'd be punished, made fun of. So they wanted to see which of these two options were more effective, okay? Because believe it or not, some people believe the negative, aversive technique was better. So knowing what we know about behaviorism today, we know that positive reinforcement is almost always, not always, but almost always more effective than punishment, okay? Or at least it's necessary along with punishment. So what ended up happening, unsurprisingly, the children in the averse therapy group grew up with speech impediments. And in fact, they were worsened by the therapy. So these children were checked in on later in their lives, and their speech impediments and issues persisted all the way out of the orphanage into late adulthood. So we would call this a very costly study. This costs these children their autonomy in later life, their ability to speak. They were taken advantage of. They weren't given the formal consent that we would have given today or given under a more watchful eye. So that's one example of how our ethical principles can prevent harm like this from being done. This one's a classic. You've maybe heard of this. There's a great documentary on this as well if you want to get more familiar, the Stanford Prison Experiment. I'll try to post links to videos about all these things. So Philip Zimbardo was the scientist behind this one, and Zimbardo's still alive. He talks at conferences. He's got a lot to say. It's very interesting. Okay, so, and it's really cool that we still have a scientist from part of, such controversial studies in the past that's still alive today and still talking about things. So the Stanford Prison Experiment was a basic experimental design. They took a group of young men, college-age men. This was done at Stanford University. They put the men into one of two groups. They screened men to make sure that they had no pre-existing psychological issues, things like aggression. They took these men, put them into the two groups, and randomly assigned them to the role of either a prisoner or a guard. Within a couple of days, 2 days into the experiment, this was set to last for, I think, 2 weeks, but within 2 days of the experiment, violence broke out, rioting and violence. The guards took so much precedence in their position that they were doing things like denying the prisoners from using their bodily functions in a normal way, like not being able to go to the bathroom, confining them to their cells, using physical force. And this study was ultimately stopped completely, I think 6 days into a 2-week experiment. So the idea here is that there has been lasting harm on those who are involved in the study because, they were exposed to a very bad side of human nature. So why is this so important? Why it's so noteworthy? We've seen this type of behavior in the world outside of research, like Abu Ghraib, I can't remember how to say it. It was a prison, I think in Iraq, in which this sort of model took place where there was torture of prisoners. So we can't do this again today. It would be unethical. But that's the take home from this. We've learned a lot from the study, but the costs outweighed the benefit. So those involved had lasting outcomes. They were pretty traumatized, even years later. There's like a talk show where they talk about their experiments, okay? And this experiment is still talked about today. You've probably talked about it in your intro to psych class. It's a very well documented study, and if you're interested, watch the documentary, the YouTube video about it. Then we have something called the Aversion Project. The Aversion project centered around one doctor. And it's interesting because it takes a look at ethics and the management of these things outside of our borders here in the US. So this was during the apartheid in South Africa. The apartheid was the legal segregation in South Africa of blacks and whites that persisted late into the 20th century. So what we have here is a Dr. Aubrey Levin. He was in the armed forces. Born in South Africa, ended up in Canada, but he was put in a position, he was a psychiatrist, and he's put in a position of curing homosexuals, specifically those involved in the armed forces in South Africa. And he did so using some very unethical means. So the idea of this study is really unethical in itself. Electroconvulsive therapy was used. Aversion therapy, if we're not familiar with this, maybe you've heard of conversion therapy, converting those who are in the LGBT group, but aversion therapy is even different than that. So aversion is trying to create an averse reaction to the stimuli that the person is attracted to. So things like having a gay man watch gay porn and then emitting electric shocks to the person. It's basically torture. There were chemical castrations done at this time, but the issue here is none of this was against the law in South Africa. Okay, so this man actually went back to Canada and continued performing as a medical doctor. He was a psychiatrist and a professor at the University of Calgary for many years until he was later taken in on a sexual assault case. So this isn't very fun to think about, right? It's very unethical, but it's really an illustration of how these things are handled, even regionally. This was recent, only back in about the 80s, that he was still able to come back to Canada and continue his practice. Okay, so this isn't that old. Even though that might sound like a long time ago to you, it was not. So this is in our recent history. And we know that things like this are still going on in more underdeveloped areas in the world, or countries that are facing more cultural issues where these things are overlooked. This mistreatment is overlooked. All right. This one's a little more lighthearted, but still it was a very powerful study. This is called the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes experiment. This was done by a woman, a teacher named Jane Elliott. She was an elementary school teacher. And this one's particularly interesting because Jane Elliott was not a researcher. She was just an elementary school teacher, right? She was working with 8-year-old-ish students, and she conducted this little experiment totally on her own. Okay, so the study was done the day after the Martin Luther King assassination, and her goal, much like the idea with the Stanford Prison Experiment, was basically pitting people against each other, although she didn't realize quite what she was getting into here, and she wasn't a psychologist, right? So why would she? She basically created a privilege system in her classroom, much like the segregation that was happening in the U.S. at the time of Martin Luther King's assassination. She gave blue-eyed children privilege over brown-eyed children in many facets in the course of her class. Like they got to go to recess quicker. They got special privileges like the drinking fountain and so on. And then she basically switched the privilege across these two groups so that the brown eyes next had all the privilege. So what happened was, as you would imagine, the groups were pitted against each other, and it's very easy to create what we call in-group and out-group ideation. You might have learned about this in your psychology class, but it's relatively easy to construct this in-group and out-group and to pit people against each other, and that is unsurprisingly, of course, what happened here. So Jane Elliott is excellent. She's also still alive today and gives talks at colleges. She might have slowed down recently, but she's excellent. So again, I recommend hearing her speak. She's very convicted in her beliefs about basically artificial segregation based on physical cues. The message she was trying to send here was that the segregation happening in the U.S. at that time was based on a trait no different than eye color, illustrating the intensity of the behavior that could change when put under this artificial segregation, when the kids just absolutely were at each other's throats. All right, this is my favorite study, the Milgram study. So you maybe heard about this in your intro to psych class or a social psych class. The social psych studies are the ones that get into the most trouble because you're pitting people against other people generally. So here, the Milgram study was a test for obedience to authority. So we have a figure, the student, the teacher, and the experimenter. Okay, in this figure, student, teacher, experimenter. The experimenter was telling the teacher what to do. And the basic format was the teacher was to administer electric shocks to the learner or the student if they got incorrect answers on a test that was being given by the experimenter. The study, of course, used deception. It was meant to look like a memory and learning study, and there was false random assignment. So the student wasn't a real person hooked up to the electric shock. They were involved with the study. They were basically an actor, and they had recordings of this student so that it was identical with each teacher. So the student was what we would call a confederate. Whenever someone got a question wrong, or whenever it was reported that a learner or student got a question wrong, the teacher was to administer increasing electric shocks. So the image shows at the bottom image, the more you go up on these switches on the switchboard, the more danger is being applied through these shocks, higher and higher shocks. So much so that in the recordings and the people that they had expressing the other side, the students or the learners, the confederate, they would say things like they're in pain and please stop and they can't take it anymore. And the experimenter would continue to urge the teacher to continue. And that's what was being tested. How long would somebody go on administering shocks to this person that was supposedly on the other side of the wall being electrocuted when they were told to do it by an authority figure? And I think somewhere around like 80% were willing to electrify the person to death just because some random authority figure told them to. So again, we can never do anything like this today. It was traumatizing. Those who completed the study were very disturbed by what was being asked of them and what they ended up doing in order to continue experimenting. And there's sort of an eerie phrase that is associated with the study. The study must go on, even when the fake participants were in so much pain. Okay, that's what they kept saying. The study must go on. The study must go on. So this is an example of bad deception. It's an excellent study, a great study, but it isn't good. It's not ethical. This is undoubtedly, it's going to leave some psychological harm on the participants. Okay, so this is what we're trying to avoid today. Okay. So while these studies can be a little bit hard to learn about now, they do help inform us about why these principles are in place. Okay, so that basically summarizes our ethics overview for the class. Yeah, please be in touch if you have any questions. All right, I hope it was interesting, and I am going to post these videos, so make sure you watch them because they're great and they're classics. All right.